He talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there's not a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, get a hold of him, call his office, visit his website. If you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issue of today. The main one being the government has kick-started its engine. It's back after the longest government shutdown in American history. Still not quite long enough, if you ask me. Keep it shut down. We didn't need any of it. I didn't notice a thing personally. Maybe I'm sitting from a position of privilege when I say that, but I didn't notice a thing with the government being shut down. What is impacted, especially with the IRS? What has been impacted?
The single biggest impact as far as the IRS is concerned is the backlogs. We had a 43-day government shutdown, longest in history. As you pointed out, disruption of IRS functions was the COVID shutdown. The reasons were not funding, obviously. It was the concern over the virus. The IRS shut down in March of 2020, and they went through June. They started reactivating in June and then fully activated by the end of July. The backlog that created was monstrous. We're not going to have the same kind of backlog this time because not every single IRS employee went home. The IRS worked at about half staff during this recent shutdown. They had roughly 35,000 people showing up for work, which obviously isn't enough to get the job done, but they were able to do some things. Where we're going to see problem areas is with the processing of paper filed tax returns. Computer filed tax returns, e-filed tax returns get processed, they get received, that's not a problem. So the paper tax returns, they were sticking into the ceiling tiles at return processing in Philadelphia. There was another city too, I forget which one, but these return processors were so over, their quotas were so high that in order to get the work off their desk, they were sticking them in ceiling tiles.
To reflect on that anecdote as a huge red flag of what a massive overburdened system this really is. There's not a single way to scale that information in a usable fashion. The IRS is trying to build a system year after year, spending trillions of dollars to make this work, and it's not.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And of course, that's an old example because it dates back to the late 1980s, before there was any such thing as e-filing. And now there's no question that the processing of electronically filed tax returns is much easier now than it was then, but not all tax returns are e-filed, right? So we've got about 165 million individual income tax returns that are filed every year, and about 80% of those, maybe 85%, are e-filed. That means there's millions and millions of tax returns that are still paper filed. We also have claims for refund that are paper filed. We also have late tax returns that are not e-filed. They have to be paper filed. So there's millions and millions of paper tax returns that go into the IRS every year, and these things need to be manually processed. In addition to that, Josh, anytime the electronic filings kicks out a tax return because it doesn't conform with e-filing protocol, there are millions of those returns that are kicked out and have to be processed manually.
So they got algorithms that file these tax returns so that most of them don't even have to see the light of day. And then some of them get kicked out and then
they have to be manually processed. Yes, exactly. Sure.
About the efficacy of manual paper filing versus electronic filing. Is there some truth that when you electronically file, it will go into an abyss and no one will ever see your tax return again?
Oh, no, that's not true. That is simply not true. An electronically filed tax return gets posted to the taxpayer's account. There's no doubt that it's received, that it's posted.
That's certainly not what I mean, but I'm saying you file this tax return, nobody reviews it. It gets posted on your account.
Not accurate. They get reviewed. Those returns can be audited. The information itself goes into what's called a tax return transcript. 5 or 6 or 7 years from now, you need a copy of your tax return. You can get a tax return transcript from the Internal Revenue Service, and all that data will be there. That return is processed and becomes your tax return for all purposes, including audit and collection purposes. It's not like it just disappears and goes away. That's not accurate, Josh. Let's get back to the backlog. We got the tax return processing backlogs. There's no question about that. The other thing is the incoming mail backlog. During the COVID shutdown, the IRS was receiving mail, but it wasn't getting processed. And this mail was getting stacked up in containers, in shipping containers, in the parking lots of the various service center campuses across the country. Now, it's obviously not that bad this time because we only had a 43-day shutdown. shutdown, half the staff was working, and the IRS was aggressively culling out of the mail the checks that were being sent in so they get posted to accounts properly. All of that was going on, no doubt about it. But there's still tens of millions of letters that the IRS receives from taxpayers every year, Josh. So those were not getting processed at full scope of what their ability or attention should have been. So we got millions of letters that are backlogged, and those things need to be processed. Taxpayer responses, information requests, requests for appeal that are handled by the IRS need to be addressed.
Rights option, the taxpayers' rights processes are all delayed, but not the IRS collection processes.
That's a good point. There's two elements of tax collection. There's automated collection, where, for example, you owe the IRS $6,782 because you filed your tax return and didn't make the full payment. That goes into automated collection before it ever goes into manual collection. It's only the real high dollar cases that end up in manual collection, where a revenue officer might knock on your door and say, hey, Josh, you owe us $160,000. Where's the money? That case is never going to be assigned for manual collection. It's going to go through automated collection. The automated collection process never shut down during that 43-day period. They continued to send out notices. They continued to send out requests for payments, that sort of thing. It was the manual activity that did not go on during that period. Collection will be fired up again, and automated collection will continue as it always has.
Is there a normal that we should expect the IRS to get back to? Is this the new normal, or what can we get back to? What exactly is normal when the IRS is stealing a third of your income on it?
How long is it going to take them to get things rolling again the way they're supposed to? The answer to that is we'll just have to wait and see. A couple of things to keep in mind. I made the point already that half their workforce continued to operate during the 43-day shutdown, but wasn't like it was in the COVID days where they just let the doors and everybody went home. We're not going to see nearly as bad backlogs this time as we saw during the COVID situation. That's number one. The IRS's workforce went from roughly 100,000 personnel down to 75,000 personnel before the shutdown. Between the end of January of 2025 and the end of September, just before the government shut down, they lost 25% of their workforce. So right off the bat, you've got the problem of a reduced workforce, which I personally don't think is a problem. I think they should cut the other 75,000 along with the income tax and the Internal Revenue Code entirely, but that's a different discussion for sure. My point is this: there are going to be handicaps getting things up and running the way they were last filing season. And we've got concerns right now. When I say we, I'm talking about the tax professional community has concerns about whether the IRS is going to be able to open the 2026 tax return filing season on time. Normally, filing season opens at the end of January. So by February 1st, you're able to file your tax return for the previous year. The IRS is telling us now that there may be some delays in starting up the filing season because A, the shutdown, B, the workforce reduction, and C, the massive changes to the tax code that came along as a result of the Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed last summer. All of those changes have to be programmed into the IRS's processing systems before the tax return filing season can be opened up. With this shutdown, the question is, are they going to be able to do that? Are they going to be able to get those computers reprogrammed and everything operational by January 31st? The answer is, I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see.
Color me an obstructionist, but I'm here sitting here rooting for anything that can get in the way of the tax filing season starting up. I'm rooting for it.
Here's the point we've reached. I have made this point repeatedly over the last 20 or 25 years that at some point in time, I have argued for replacement of the income tax and the Internal Revenue Service since the early 1990s when my book, How to Fire That.
I actually have a video of him doing this right below this one on our content. I love this. I went searching for old content and found a C-SPAN video of him saying pretty much the exact same things 35, 40 years ago. And it's cool because it's almost coming out of my face. So anyways.
Josh, how old were you in 1995? That's when I did that video. That was with the Cato Institute. We did a congressional policy forum in Washington. It was April of 1995. C-SPAN carried the video. That's the video that you found. This is what, 35 years ago or so. I was a younger man in those days. Yeah, I was. That was one of the first public debates we did on abolishing the income tax and whether we should adopt a national retail sales tax or a flat tax in place of the income tax. It was my arguments that formed the basis of the proposition that that we should abolish the IRS and the income tax, lock, stock, and barrel. That started the debate that carried us through the rest of the 90s. The point is, Josh, that I maintained starting at about the year 2000, at the turn of the century into probably 2005, that Congress was never going to do the right thing for the right reason. They were never going to come to their senses and realize that this system is untenable and needs to be abolished. About that time, we're talking 20 years now, that the IRS is going to collapse of its own weight. And one of the things that we see as a result of this shutdown is the inability of the federal government to function properly insofar as collecting revenue is concerned when we got these kinds of shutdowns. They cannot administer the system properly. When the system starts to collapse of its own weight, that's when we're going to see Congress wake up and say, we got to do something different. I believe these shutdowns highlight this fact that we've got a system that is untenable from an administrative standpoint. We need to rethink this. It is far too data intensive, data driven, and has got to be reformatted to something far more self-sustaining and far more self-administrating. And most certainly a consumption tax does that, in my opinion.
The story of the Tower of Babel keeps flashing through my brain for many different reasons, but it's mainly because of this idea that we can build something so vast and so great and so all-encompassing that it somehow rivals God. And instead of being able to do that, we can't even talk to each other properly, and we shut the government down for 43 days.
It's really quite incredible. And when you look at the Tower of Babel context of the Internal Revenue Code and what the IRS has to administer, there's 165 million individual income tax returns filed. There's another 110 million business tax returns filed. There's roughly 5 billion information returns filed, W-2s, 1099s, those kinds of things. And this is just massive information reporting, massive data gathering. And the IRS is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to assimilate that data and sort it out and make sense out of it and classify it. It's just a massive, giant domestic spy network where they have...
There's a certain evil undertone of the IRS stealing your money in order to build a network that steals your data to spy on you more.
Well, that's what they have to do. They have to ubiquitously spy on every aspect of every citizen and business in this country to effectively administer the income tax laws. The giant red flag in my mind when you look at the amount of data that has to be collected to administer these laws, a reasonable person has to conclude that there's got to be a better way to do this. Is the worst possible way to do it.
A reasonable person is to conclude that the only reason we're not doing it the better way is for some other insidious,
yes,
and that
yes,
is control over people's lives.
When they have your data, that leads to control. There's no doubt about that. It leads to the government's ability to pick winners and losers in the marketplace, for example, which is one of the essential functions of the income taxes, to allow Congress to say, we're going to punish this business because we don't agree this particular industry should be pursued. Fossil fuels, for example, was one of the evil industries during the Biden administration, and we want to promote this other industry over here, this clean energy, which was in favor during the Biden administration, punishing this business and promoting that business using the tax code.
The irony of that whole situation is they favored Elon during Biden's administration, but the second he took Trump's side, now he's evil, and all of his cars and all of his companies are...
And now they don't want to support him anymore. Take Elon out of the mix for just a second. The Trump administration takes control. The Republicans take control of the House and the Senate. The point is, Josh, that now the roles reversed entirely. Now we want to support fossil fuel production and diminish our support for alternative energy and electric vehicles. The marketplace should be the one and only place where businesses are either supported or they're not supported. In other words, consumers ultimately have to make the choice to support this industry and not support that industry, not government.
The market should decide what energy is viable. But the point is, they have options out there that if they opened up, the market would choose these options that are better and more sustainable. They don't give those.
I think it was Frederic Bastiat, the great French economist, that pointed out that when buying and selling is subject to legislation, the first thing that gets bought and sold is legislators. And that is the problem with government dictating winners and losers in the marketplace. And that is a core problem with the federal income tax, that it gives the government the power to pick winners and losers in the marketplace. And that cannot happen in a free society.
It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you are on. Chances are you've probably complained about your legislator being bought and sold.
Correct. That's correct.
You mentioned that the taxpayer advocate functioned during the shutdown. Does that mean they are not backlogged?
No, it doesn't mean that at all, because the taxpayer advocate had limited resources as well. The full operational capacity of the taxpayer advocate was not realized during the shutdown. And so they had to focus on solely one narrow aspect of case processing. That was the extreme hardship cases. For example, if somebody was and the levy was causing a hardship, that is to say, put that person into a position where they could not pay necessary living expenses, those are the cases the taxpayer advocate worked. They did not work any other kind of case. So for example, if last summer you requested a collection due process hearing and you haven't heard anything from the IRS, and you reach out to the taxpayer advocate and say, hey, what's going on with my hearing? I want my collection due process hearing. They wouldn't work that case. During the shutdown, they only had ship cases that they were dealing with. So now they got to pick up the rest of those cases and start working the rest of those inquiries. I haven't seen any numbers at the taxpayer advocate's office on this issue, but there's got to be an awful lot of them.
You've been talking about the impact this might have on the 2026 filing season. I think you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, I did. I alluded to that earlier, that the fact is that the IRS has got to spend a great deal of time now reprogramming their return processing computers to deal with the changes that were made. Those have to be incorporated into tax returns. So the tax returns themselves have to be redesigned, and all of the processing codes that the IRS creates have to be sent out to all the private enterprises out there, Josh, that do tax return preparation. We've got all kinds of businesses that provide electronic filing services to tax professionals like myself and individuals like yourself. All right, you can go to TurboTax, for example, and buy tax preparation software. Those processing codes are provided by the IRS. I don't know what the technical lingo is, but they have to produce this information that can be used by the private sector. There's a massive workload ahead of the IRS to get this done before the filing season kicks in.
Is there precedent for them to kick the filing deadline down the road more than a couple of days?
Yeah, there is precedent, and that comes from the COVID shutdown. The April 15th filing deadline was pushed off to, I believe it was June 15th. The IRS has the administrative authority to do that. There's precedent for it. Furthermore, it happens every single year in disaster areas, right? Fire, flood, hurricane hits 5 counties here or 8 counties there, whatever that may be. The IRS always grants filing and payment extensions for people in those disaster areas. So there is precedent for doing that.
During this process, you talked about the importance of the Office of Appeals and its role in solving problems for taxpayers and running at their full potential.
I don't know that they're at their full potential yet. They're getting their staff back. I actually talked to 2 IRS appeals officers just today on cases that I got pending. So they're back in the office. The problem is they were hit hard with personnel reductions apart from the shutdown, right? They lost upwards of 1,000 employees in the Office of Appeals as a result of the personnel reductions that took place between January and September that we talked about. So the appeals office is understaffed, never mind the shutdown. They need to get people back in that office, and they need to get people hired for that office. I believe the Office of Appeals, Josh, is one of the most important functions in the Internal Revenue Service in terms of helping taxpayers resolve cases. I've got a case in the appeals office right now. My client received a bill from the IRS for about $240,000. By the time I'm done with the appeals office, his liability is going to be less $40,000. This is an important function in the Internal Revenue Service for resolving problems that freak people out. The appeals office is a necessary function. They've got to be properly trained and staffed, and we'll see what happens with that going forward.
The great irony of wishing the IRS had more employees while at the same time wishing the IRS didn't have more employees.
Well, how do you square that contradiction? The function of the appeals office is to solve problems with taxpayers, not cause them. All right? I want trained and educated people in a function whose intention, whose design is to solve problems. As long as we're going to have this tax system, we need a system that provides outreach, assistance, and education to taxpayers. Under the heading of assistance comes the appeals office, and it's a vital function.
So what's next for appeals? Do we have any information on if they're getting more funding or anything?
What's next for appeals is direct hire authority. The IRS has been pushing Congress to give the Office of Appeals direct hire authority, meaning they can hire their own people directly and don't have to go through the Office of Personnel Management and all these various steps bureaucracies have to follow to hire people. Over the years, there's some precedent for the IRS, certain functions of the IRS having direct hire authority, and they're working to get that now. I hope that happens. We'll see.
have a question here. Determining how much of the IRS budget goes into appeals would be a function typically reserved for the IRS.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That'd be a commissioner of IRS function. When they put together their budget request, they have to break down exactly how that money is going to be used. Appeals would have a separate line item, a separate account in the budget to fund their operations.
The question then is Trump's appointee to whatever the new CEO thing is, are they going to put any focus on the actual relevant issues of appeals? Or are they going to?
That's a good question. This CEO is the commissioner of the Social Security Administration. He's doing two jobs, commissioner of Social Security and CEO of the IRS. There's still no nominee for a commissioner of the IRS. So you've got one guy doing two massive jobs. And what that likely means, Josh, what that historically means is he doesn't do either one of them very well. Only time will tell as to whether this will be different. I don't expect that it will, but we'll see. And so that would be his responsibility, is to make sure appeals gets properly staffed and funded, along with the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate, because these are the people helping Jane and Joe Americans suffering under the weight of this tax system. I'm not talking about the financial weight necessarily. That's bad enough. I'm talking about the compliance problems that grow out of this tax system, which are
massive. The last thing I want to ask about is very clear that the government workers are going to getting back pay.
Yeah, they made that
days that they didn't have to do their job, or in some cases they were doing their job, but in many cases the 43 days that they didn't have to do their job. My question as a taxpayer is, what line item on the tax return do I fill out that says 43 days minus on my overall year of taxes? Because obviously I don't have to pay 43 days of government that didn't happen, right?
There's going to be no line on the tax return that says deduction allowed for government workers who didn't come to work. But of course, if they get back pay, then you'd say you had to pay them anyway. The answer is, nice idea, but there's going to be no line on the tax return. In the state of Minnesota, we need a line on our tax return in the state of Minnesota, because we got the ongoing fraud that's going on in the state. You've got the Feeding Our Future. Some people watching our podcast may not be aware of the Feeding Our Future fraud. Alleged non-government organizations that were going to take this COVID money and feed starving children in the state literally bilked $250 million, $250 million out of federal and state governments to run these frauds. Now we're seeing homeless center fraud and autism treatment center fraud. Federal prosecutors in Minnesota think that this fraud might go as high as $2 billion. This is mostly state money being stolen by fraudsters. There should be a line item on the Minnesota tax return that will allow a deduction for state fraud. It's so bad in this state, it's unbelievable.
On that note, I think that's all we got for today. If you are currently facing a tax problem, like living in Minnesota, I don't know if we can help you there. I think that might be the only hopeless tax case. Just kidding. There is no such thing as a hopeless tax case. All right, that's all for this week. Thanks for watching, taxpayers. Remember, there's no such thing as a hopeless tax case. And if you think yours is the exception, get a hold of Dan here. Call his office. He will help you see the daylight. Dan, tell them where else they can follow along with your taxpayers' rights are safe.
Follow me on social media. I'm at Pilla Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Facebook, True Social, and right here on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe and share these videos, especially share them with your state and federal representatives. And if you have a tax problem, go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com. Buy any book off my website at any price point. You get a free 15-minute consultation directly and personally with me. So go to the website now, TaxHelpOnline.com.